Hi, I'm Rick. Welcome to Elbow Shots. Today we're going to be doing a laminate countertop with a tile backsplash. Let's go take a look. Here we have an older kitchen countertop with a butcher block pattern installed with the grain all oriented in the same direction. A cedar windowsill behind the sink and conventional backsplashes with full metal trim. A couple of months ago I installed this vinyl plank flooring. Join me now as I transform this tired old galley into a more modern, updated kitchen. We're going to tie the tile backsplash into the windowsill. Let's begin by removing the old laminate backsplash. These are coming off fairly easily, which makes me wonder about the rest of the job. The next thing I'll have to do is get this stove out of the way. I usually use a couple of carpet scraps turned upside down to protect the floor when I move heavy items like appliances. These strips are about 1 foot wide and about 4 feet long. This allows me to tip the machine side to side to get under the feet. Once I get the stove pulled out, I can unplug it and slide it out of the way. The original range was a built-in that had a smaller cutout than this freestanding unit. The nail holes that you see in the wall were from a ledger that was supporting a strip of countertop behind the range. Both were removed to accommodate a freestanding range. Modifications made to the cabinetry were good enough at the time to make it functional. Let's see what we can do to make it better. Typically, we need 30 1/8 inches of clearance for a freestanding range before the self-edge is applied. It looks like we still have a little bit of room to clean up these edges. Using a framing square and an ultrafine Sharpie, I mark my cut lines. Measuring across from line to line shows that I'll be right at my limit, exactly 30 1/8. I set the depth of my skill saw to cut through the self-edge, then plug it in. The deeper setting also helps me keep my cut line straighter because by cutting closer to the center of the circular blade, I'm using more surface area of the blade, which minimizes twisting. I got nice clean cuts here. I'll have to finish those off with a multi-master. This piece of self-edge is pretty loose, so I'll pull it off. Since it's easier to continue pulling laminate off than it is to get it started, it's best to take your time. Once it breaks, you have to start the process again. And sometimes it's easier to start at the wall, because it hasn't been rolled that well over there. Cutting through the glue leaves a better surface than ripping the laminate off, because ripping it off can pull off chunks of the wood underneath. It looks like this piece had come loose before and someone tried to fix it with a hot glue gun. That's not a terrible idea, it just didn't hold. Now to finish my range cutout. Hang on a second. During my initial walkthrough, I discovered another loose spot over here by the sink. The laminate is bubbling up here, likely because water has gotten underneath it. Notice the black staining along the base of the backsplash. Meanwhile, back at the range, using my multi-master to finish my cut, I found another loose spot. The work ticket said to go over the existing laminate after cleaning up some minor deficiencies. It's starting to look like I'm going to have to peel it all off. One side done, let's finish the other side. Guess what? Another loose spot. There's no question in my mind now, all of this is going to have to come off. Let's pull that sink out. The black staining indicates it has gotten wet back here, and it just feels loose. All of this laminate is coming off, so I'll start with this end here. I like to use this carpet knife because the long thin blade will reach in a couple of inches without bending the laminate too much. I don't try to take it all in one pass, just the tip at first to loosen the edge, then a second pass with more depth. This whole countertop is pretty loose, so it's coming out easily. Also, because of the finer grain, particle board will give up much easier than plywood. Plywood subtops tend to shred when you remove laminate. Most countertops are not going to cooperate like this. This is a catastrophic failure of an installation. The adhesive looks like the same solvent-based adhesive that I used for decades without a problem. The most likely reason for failure was insufficient heat. Regardless of the type of adhesive, you need heat for a proper installation. The site, adhesive, and laminate should be maintained at a minimum of 68 degrees Fahrenheit 24 hours before, during, and 24 hours after installation. 70 to 72 is better. Using force to pull off this self-edge shredded the 1x2 underneath. Instead of destroying the rest of it, I'm going to heat the glue with a heat gun to soften it up. I know this little cabinet is loose at the back by the range, so I'll work on these other edges first. Almost got it all. Just need to finish it with the scraper. Remember, if the laminate starts cracking, stop what you're doing and approach it from a different angle. It's much easier to continue than it is to get it started again. Laminate only likes to roll or bend in one direction at a time. Don't fight against the nature of the beast. Work with it to get the results that you want. The next step is to use a razor blade scraper to knock off any big chunks and remove swelling caused by water intrusion. Then I go over the whole thing with a belt sander. The darker spots that you can still see along the self-edge, where the sander didn't touch, indicate low spots that were not dealt with in the original installation. And along the back here you can see where water has gotten to the substrate. It looks like it's just staining and not actively growing mold. I sprayed it with bleach solution just to be safe. Then I clean up the edges with a file. In a couple of spots where the sander can't get right up to the wall, I use the file to blend the deck and the edge. The front edge of the file isn't really sharp, but it can be used to remove some material. Since the belt sander can't get up against the wall at all here, I can detail it out with the file. Now it's time to remove the old windowsill, beginning with the casing. This burn-off scraper is really a multi-purpose tool. I use it as a scraper or to remove trim, or sometimes even as a chisel. But the original wooden handle didn't hold up very long with me beating on it with a hammer. So I put on a pipe nipple with a cap as a replacement. I'm punching down the nails so that I can slide the windowsill out from underneath the vertical window wrap. Another option would be to cross-cut the sill somewhere in the middle and take it out in two pieces. This tapered punch didn't quite get the nails down far enough, so I'll use the scraper and hammer to flatten them down. I can't get enough clearance to flatten the nails on the ends, so I'm just going to bend them over. Now here I'm not prying on the window frame, I'm just trying to hook the sill out of there. Well, it isn't ever going to come out of there with the casings in place. So let's see exactly where I want to cut them off. The total height of the backsplash is going to be higher than the existing windowsill, and we can't raise the windowsill any higher than it already is because of the window frame. I'm going to square up the bottom of the casing to plane in with the top of the windowsill using the multi-master. When I'm done, I want it to look like the tile was done before the trim. I'll be able to notch out the bullnose and make a cheater cut that breaks underneath the casing. Then do the same on the other side. When you're cutting pieces of trim that may be a little loose, you may have to hang on to it or add nails to keep it from vibrating with the blade. If it's moving with the blade, it isn't cutting. Now let's get that windowsill out of there. With the prep work done, it's time to switch to install mode. This strip of white along the edge of the laminate is not a flaw. This is the reason why the actual size of the sheet is usually an inch longer than the call size. There's a 1/2 inch manufacturer's margin around the perimeter of the sheets. It allows us room to trim off that edge without losing too much material. After trimming that off with the laminate slitter, I can cut my self-edge. I'll fit the end pieces of self-edge first so I can apply adhesive, and while that's drying, I'll go make some more cuts. First, I'd like to talk about the old countertop for a second. Even with all the problems and loose spots in that countertop, and the backsplash barely hanging on, it was still functional after 30 years. This is why I emphasize the importance of the bond at the front edges. Do you get that? Also remember that we are working with plastic laminate. Plastic is more pliable when it's warm and so will conform to the shape of the substrate. Alright, the long countertop will take up most of the length of the sheet, so I first cut it to depth for the entire length of the sheet. After I snap it, I can cut it to length. I'm being extremely careful as I finish my cut so I don't run scoroll off the edge of the laminate and damage the floor. The self-edge ends should be dry by now. Let's go back into the kitchen. This first piece of edging needs to tuck into the 3/4 inch paneling. Since there's no way for me to file the top of the edging flush with the deck, I'm going to pre-cut and file it in that area. Once it's in place, I can roll it and clip off the excess. I like to file the top of the corner flush with the deck right now, so it doesn't interfere with the router bit when I'm trimming the front self-edge. I get the front edges fitted and glued, then head back over to my cut station. The balance piece is about 31 inches wide. I'm not going to need the full length, so I'll cut these two smaller pieces to length at the same time, and then cut them to width together. This leaves a more usable balance for another project. The carbide tip can do some real damage to a finished floor. To protect the floor from damage by the scoroll, sometimes I use a scrap of laminate or plywood underneath the cut. It's much safer that way. Now to fit the deck. Since this little corner requires the least attention, I'll let it ride up on the paneling while I fit to the walls. I scribe the back wall and the end wall at the same time. With a long straight countertop like this one, I can spin the sheet around so that I can get my work closer to me. It makes it easier to trim that way. Allow the other end to roll up the wall. Trim it off with the shears and file it. I always file the cut edge to remove crumbs and dull the edge. This job is a lot more fun when I don't cut my hands on sharp edges. Flip it back around, check the fit at the walls, and now we can trim to the paneling. Mark it at the depth of the wood paneling and to the edge of the countertop. Be careful when making this kind of a cut. Using the very tip of the shears will sometimes crack the laminate. It's usually better to cut deeper into the jaws and stop at your cross line. It's still making contact with the paneling, but there isn't any tension on it. It's all lying flat, so I'm going to call that good. I mark the perimeter for orientation and then outline the sinkhole. Any adhesive spread inside the sink lines is wasted, so it's mostly for glue conservation. It isn't really necessary to fit these small tops tightly to the walls because the tile backsplash will cover any irregularities. I do it because it makes assembly easier for me. If the piece is shaped like the wall, it's keyed into position. You'll see in a minute another way that I use those pencil lines during assembly. In most of my other videos, I use the green contact cement. I prefer it because it makes it easier to see any excess, which makes it easier to clean up. This is the neutral color, which dries almost clear. The adhesive properties are the same. Color is the only difference. Because I have limited room to lay out my pieces to dry, I'm going to lean these sheets against the cabinets. But first I want to make sure I don't pick up any debris from the floor. I'm flipping the sheets around so that the front edge with the overhang margin is in contact with the floor. This makes it less likely that the sheet will pick up any contaminants. Now I can spread the subtops. Remember to spread the adhesive evenly and consistently. Pay particular attention to the front edge. With the adhesive dry, I checked with my hands to make sure I didn't miss any Klingons with my eyes. I bought my first set of blinds at a thrift store in 1983, and they're still in use today. I flipped the sheet back around for the last time, slide it into place, and pull out the blinds. I pulled 2 at the end wall and 1 out here to tack it down. Now the sheet won't move when I'm pulling out the rest of the blinds. Make sure it isn't hanging up on the wall anywhere. Lightly broom the sheet flat, then it can be rolled, giving attention to the edges. Make sure you don't accidentally snap off the overhang with the roller. There's a part of me that likes to do this when a customer is watching. Their reactions are priceless. This countertop is small enough for me to put in place without the blind slats. I do not recommend this if you don't have much experience. Use the slats. Because I hadn't rolled this yet, I was able to reposition the sheet. With this even smaller top, I can place my fingers at the pencil lines, which allows me to put the back edge against the wall in perfect position. To keep the router bit from destroying the self edge, I set the bit so that the cutters are at the depth of the thickness of the laminate. Then I shoot a little WD-40 on the bearing to help keep it from gumming up. Then plug in the router and trim the edge. When I get to the sink cutout, I can set the router bit a little deeper. There is no self edge inside the sink cutout, and this keeps the cutters working through any distortions in the laminate. How do you deal with that last little tab where the router won't reach? You can place a block of wood on top of it, and with a utility knife, score it from underneath. The tab will snap off along that line. Brush off the router debris and clean up all the edges with a file. That takes care of the laminate installation. Join me for part 2, where I'll show you how I did the tile backsplash with mismatched tile from a big box store, and how I tiled the windowsill into that backsplash. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to help keep these videos coming.